Hi Internet, hope you're well. Well, today we're doing a sand tutorial, or rather, an update of the sand tutorial for trails and loaded maxi trails that go on trips. Because since that video, which you'll have to check out if you don't remember it or haven't seen it, you little rascal, a lot has happened. Before I explain all that, I think you know the drill. Intro. Hello Internet, I hope you're well. I'm Tom and I'm delighted to share with you my passion for extreme sports and surpassing yourself. I want to go far, but for that I need your help. So don't forget to subscribe. For you, it's no big deal, but for me, it can change everything. Bon Internet, we're on the track that crosses the Chigaga Erg. It's one of the emblematic sandy tracks of the African Dakar era. It may seem difficult, but the Africa Eco Race passed through here this year, and I saw 2 or 3 people struggling a bit. But if you have the right tips, it's not that complicated. What we're going to see is how to try and get out of these kinds of trails easily. It may sound like a big project, but it's not that hard. You just have to know how. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of internet technology, I'll tell you what changed my mind. It's really quite simple. This bike, again, it's not a question of BMW or anything, it's more a question, I think, of my analysis of things at the moment. Road XC and suspension to match. Last year I came here to this very track with the XT. I was extremely close to what I told you about the #1 sand tuto I'd done in GS. It's still totally valid. What we're going to see today is an evolution of everything I told you back then. For me, this evolution, and what we're going to see today, is due to the Gixikan road and suspensions really adapted to what we're doing. So basically, on the internet, everything I told you in the first tutorial still applies to bikes with Dex 9-inch front wheels and suspensions that are more suited to the road. The worst bike in the world for sand riding, even though I love it, is the GS. That's not going to change. It's going to be very complicated. And the more you have a bike that's adapted to off-road riding, the easier it's going to be. That's the basic premise. If you've got a bike that's really adapted to off-roading, you'll be able to attack and have fun. If you've got a bike that's a little less adapted, you'll be able to get through a little more difficult terrain. Now we're going to get down to the technical side of things. And what makes a track like this hard is the number of ruts you see behind it. That's the real difficulty of this kind of trek. The first thing we're going to talk about is tire pressure. To explain the difference between a bike on Route 99 and a bike on Route 61. If you don't lower the pressures, a motorcycle on Road 99 is virtually unrideable in the sand. Really, it's very, very, very difficult. A motorcycle as it is, adapted for what we're going to do, in road pressure, i.e. an 8, it can be ridden. It's difficult, but it can be ridden. You can't attack to set a time, but it can be driven. So if you lower the pressure on a bike like that, you can send the squalls flying, you can send out the squalls. As for tubeless roads, whether it's the GS or the XT I had last year, it doesn't change. We're at around 500 grams, or even less. We can even go down to almost 0. Here, we're in a standard tube. I'm not going to lie to you, that was one of my fears when I came here this year. We've just done 10 days in the sand, riding like pigs, and we've had 0 punctures. We put gripsters on before coming, which is something that's supposed to prevent the inner tube from spinning around the rim. The internet gripster is just that. It's this little valve in addition to the pressure valve that's here. It's a little plastic part that you put in the rim to prevent the inner tube from turning. We always put one on the rear wheel, because under acceleration, that's where there's a risk of tearing off the valve. And if you're trying to go fast, you also put one on the front wheel, because that's where you're going to be able to rip the valve off under braking. Valve. In fact, it worked, because even with low pressure, we were able to drive. Low pressure on tubing like we've got here means it's not as low as on lesser tubing. We're down to around 1 kilo, 900 grams, 1 kilo at the rear, which works extremely well, and we're down to around 600 grams at the front. So the first difficulty with this type of track we're going to talk about is getting over the ruts. It's going to be tricky, especially at first, but you're going to have to be able to ride relaxed. What does that mean? It means you're going to have to put yourself at the bottom of the rut, let the front wheel do its thing, let your arms do their work, and try to stay at the bottom of the rut. It's much easier if the pressure's off, but the real secret is to let go of the handlebars and ride relaxed. As I've just told you, the arms should just be put down to manage the controls, but they really have to let the handlebars live. As for body position, it's going to be a little more rearward, where the arms can move really like that. I won't necessarily, even though, as Christoph pointed out, it can help. The idea once again is to be as relaxed as possible. So yes, if it frees up your arms, you can squeeze a little, but you mustn't lock them completely either. In any case, what's important is to be able to move. I'll show you right after. But in theory, on a track like this, you need to be able to ride by letting go of one hand or the other. The right hand is complicated because you need the gas pedal, but you have to be able to roll at least by letting go of the left hand. Left hand. As for the basic internet rule, it doesn't change. In the sand, you have to try to be on the sand and not in the sand. So, especially on a rutted track like this one, you're going to have to ride with a minimum of speed. The more speed you use, the easier it's going to be. I know it's scary at first and it's not easy, but really, you're going to have to push yourself to put on a bit of speed. The idea is to keep the bike on the rear at all times. That's why it's so difficult on a GS. In GS, the telehandler is so heavy in front that the bike's attitude is more towards the front. What we want is to keep the rear of the Machine level so that the front is very light and can get through all the ruts. So, we're going to have to maintain a minimum speed at all times. This minimum speed is around 30 kilometers an hour. If you're below that, you're going to get stuck in ruts, and that's going to be a real pain. So, you have to try to get up to 30 kilometers an hour, or even more. Objectively speaking, that's the cruising speed in cruising mode on a track like this, is around 50 kilometers an hour. That may sound like a lot, but when you're at that speed, it's easy. And to give you an idea, if you're really in attack mode, you can easily be at 80, even 100 kilometers an hour with a loaded trail. That just goes to show how hard you can push. As for the gear ratio or ratios we're going to use, in the previous video, I told you we're going to start in second gear. With these bikes, that's not necessarily the case. Personally, I use first gear a lot to get away. The second one is really for the hardest times. Why is that? I'll give you the same answer as before. Road 21, the bike's overall appearance, and especially the suspension. You might think it's the weight. Weight certainly has an influence, but then again, objectively speaking, there's not much difference between what I had before and what I have now. Between the Dix 50 XT and this bike, there's only a 20 kilo difference. So, in terms of luggage, I had about the same last year. Weight is a factor, but it's not the only one. So, once again, the softer it is, the harder it is going to be to get away. So the more power you need, the more you're going to choose second gear and go like a Tabana. The more buoyant it is, as it is now, the more the first gear will allow you to get away without necessarily having to force it. If you don't, that's what's going to wear you out in the end. To get out of it, the technique remains the same. The less effort you put into it, the easier it will be to get out of it. You have to throw the bike on the ground, pull the rear wheel out of the hole, fill it up again, and off you go again. That's what's so exhausting at first, because you miss starts, you get tired, you lay it down, you fill it up again, you lift it up again, you start it up again. It's hellish. That's why sand in the beginning is hyper physical. I'm going to tell you exactly the same thing I told you in the previous video, internet. I don't know anyone who didn't hate sand when they first started out, wondering what the hell they were doing there. But I also don't know anyone who didn't think it was fabulous once he'd figured it out. By the way, on the internet, when it comes to managing the number of engine revolutions, it's true that you have to be fairly high up in the rev range, but the lower you go, the more efficient it will be. There's absolutely no point in being a big shot like Robin and staying at the ignition switch for 20 seconds. See, it's not good for the engine and it's not effective in the sand. At worst, you have to use the ignition switch for 1 or 2 seconds, but that's all. And that's just to get out of a tricky situation. The rest of the time, you need to be in mode. So, as far from the breaker as possible. I've talked about gears for starting off and being able to launch the internet bike, but we also need to talk about gears when you're simply going to be riding in the sand. The basic rule remains the same for me as for the rest of my maxi trail life. If it's technical, first, Once again, with these bikes, with bigger bikes like the GS or the Thai 50 XT is debatable, but the basic rule remains the same. If it's technical, first. Then, when you ride and evolve on this type of track, it becomes much less technical once you've got the hang of it. You'll quickly find yourself in second, third, or even fourth gear, depending on how you're going. In this case, you don't have to think about speeds anymore because you're above the sand, you're just rolling. You simply set the appropriate speed so that the engine doesn't rev too high. Well, now that we've said all that, I'll give you some more detailed explanations on the move. As far as the start is concerned, internet, as I said earlier, you've got to go for it, but you don't necessarily have to start like a madman. Here, I'm going to start in first gear, I'm going to put on a bit of throttle, and as soon as the bike lifts off, I'm going to take some off. As for the importance of being relaxed internet, if you've got the right gear, look at how much you can let it live. Right now I'm really letting it go. Sand is soft, you just let it happen. Then I let the bike work, all supple, letting go of my hands so much that I let it do its thing, and I let it live, I let it move. Once you've started, you try to get up to your minimum speed of around 30 kilometers an hour, and you're really going to let your arms live. You have to be able, at any moment, to let go of the handlebars. There's really no need to hold it. If you feel comfortable at that moment, you'll be able to do your second. And you keep going, you're calm, quiet, and as smooth as possible. As for braking or slowing down, we haven't talked about that. The sand will make you slow down on its own, so at times you don't even need to brake. Just cut the throttle. You just have to cut off the throttle and pick it up again at the back. Braking will come later. To brake, you need to be as supple as possible. And once you're comfortable, that's when you can start to apply the throttle. That's when you can accelerate. We're cruising at 50 kilometers an hour. And then you're not in attack mode, you're just in the mode where the bike lives and makes its way quietly. And once again, I can drive one-handed, getting into the bottom of ruts. And with the low pressures, if I want, I can even change ruts. And once you've understood that, you can really put the throttle on. And that's when you start to potentially need to brake. And to brake, you have to go for it, but you have to go smoothly. Watch out for little holes and compressions. In the bends, we're going to look for support in the sand. And we're really going to be able to use the sand to turn and accelerate. Watch out, you're dropping again. Here, you really need suspensions that are adapted to the loads you have. And you see sand in shit? There are 5 kilometers per hour that you have to press on the speedometer. And I'm really not pushing it. I could totally go faster. So if I sum up everything I've just said, internet, there are 3 steps when you roll on a piece of sand. The step where you drive at the very minimum speed, i.e. 30 kilometers an hour. Below that, it's really too complicated. Then you move on to step 2. This is the step where you ride at a speed appropriate to the circumstances, where the bike is working well. We're going to say between 40 and 50 kilometers an hour, the speed we're currently at, where, once again, you need to be relaxed, you can let it live and look, you don't even need to be given over to driving, you let the bike move in all directions, it's no big deal. That's really the difficulty of sand. You have to accept that the bike moves in all directions and that this is normal. That's its reality, its normality. And then there's step 3. Step 3 is when you send it like a pig. You have to earn that one because the faster you go, more when you go satellite, you'll get there fast. But frankly, once you get the hang of it, it's pure bliss.